All right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for coming. This is the Lake Bluff School District 65 Board of Education regular meeting for October 22nd, 2013. And can we please have a roll call, Christine?
Mark Berry.
Present.
John Morosen.
Present.
Christine Lechner, present. Leanne Charlotte.
Present.
Julie Gotchel. Absent. Richard A.
Here.
Sue Wright.
Here.
So we have a quorum and we can proceed, and we're going to start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. First thing we do is we offer the opportunity for anybody who would like to address the board to please step forward. We welcome comments from our staff, parents, and constituents. The board president, that's me, will determine the format and ground rules for comments in the best interest of the audience and the agenda. So if anybody would like to address the board, please feel free. And if you could, just state your name and your address.
Hi, my name is Bill Herman. I live at 516 Center, and I came to the meeting today trying to understand some more about the decision that looks like is planned for today with respect to refunding and issuing new bonds. I had reviewed, and I fully appreciate and commend the board on trying to reduce the debt service and take down the reserves a bit. I'm kind of at a loss. I looked at the numbers that were prepared in the presentation that was given by William Blair, and the numbers seem different from what I'm looking at now and what's being presented tonight. So I'm hoping that you guys are going to have a full discussion of what this all is and what this means and explain it to all of us, because what I was concerned with, what I saw before, was this year it looks like we're in a pattern of deficit spending and eating into the reserves to the tune of, I guess, almost a couple $2 million a year, it looks like, on these numbers. And I had seen some other numbers in what the William Blair numbers that didn't really have I guess the revenue side of it was only like expenditure side, but it seemed to me that the reserve was going to be eaten up quite quickly if the deficit spending was going to continue at the level at which it was running, and then layering on to that any sort of reduction in the reserve to address the new bond issue seemed to me to put us in a situation of continually being in deficit spending and having no reserve in a very short period of time, over about 4 or 5 years it looked like. Just looking at those numbers, and I think that seems to me to be an untenable position to put the district, because it seems like we'd have to be going back with a referendum or something to provide more revenue to keep the schools operating with the same amount of services that they're providing currently, unless there was something done on the revenue or expense side beyond just this new refunding bond. So I'm not seeing those numbers sort of flowing through here anymore, and I guess I can't really understand why just being presented with this right now, but I'd like, hoping that you all are going to address those things during this deliberation.
Let me point out a couple things. The most recent, just to check your dates, the most recent bond presentation that we work off of is the October 7th date, and it's scenario number 2 is essentially what we're voting on tonight. And there's some discrepancy in the numbers between what we saw last time and what we're voting on tonight because of uncertainty due to the interest rates at which the bonds will be executed at. And so there's some minor differences there. Jane's presentation on the levy will address, I think will address your questions and concerns about projections and deficit spending in the future. So,
And we've got both of our consultants here today too.
Maybe I can jump in here for a second because I'm not quite sure I understand. So unfortunately, we weren't here last week. We had a rather in-depth discussion about this. But let me frame this a little bit. There's $16 million currently sitting in reserves. That's 100% of our expenses, okay? The state requires 25%. As a board, we are thinking 30 to 50 makes reasonable sense because roughly 95% of our revenues come from tax dollars, and those are fixed. Those don't change very much. So the need for the reserves aren't as great as you might think they are, number one. Number two, we're taking roughly $5.75 million out of the reserves, which will still leave us a 60% reserve balance, almost $10 million, okay? The deficit spending, I think, only occurs for this year, and maybe the following year we'll have to address that. So we never see the reserve ever getting much below $8 million, I think was the number, and I'm just pulling numbers out here. Never see it getting below 8, which is still at a 50% level, which will be the top end of our parameters. And even then, we struggle with what we're going to do with the reserve. Those are taxpayers' dollars, as you well know. So we struggle with how are we potentially going to use those reserves. And we looked last week at a worst case example. What's the worst case that the school district will face in the next 10 years? And we came up with, I think, $2.5 million. So I think, and I think the board would agree with me, that we're in a very conservative position with respect to the reserve after we restructure the bonds. And the bonds, by the way, let me point this out. We're investing $5.7 million to get ultimately back $8 million. And that money is currently sitting, the reserve sits in virtually a no interest, as you might expect, account. So we're investing $5.75 million. We're going to net $2.5 million. So we're going to get back up to $8 million. That's a pretty darn good investment. It's a good way to invest those reserve dollars for the future and for our district as we view it. Otherwise, the money sits in reserve with no potential use. So,
what do you mean by get back? You're just paying less interest over time? Is that what you mean by getting back?
We're taking $5.75 million out of the reserve to restructure bonds. And in the end, that produces a total savings of $8 million. So if you subtract 5 from 8, 5.75, 6 from 8, you get about $2.5 million net savings.
Right, but that's just based on interest expense and coverage?
And restructuring the bonds, because the way the current bonds are structured, I'm going to talk about this a little later on, the current bonds have an increasing coupon rate. I don't know if you're aware of that. The current bond coupon rate will jump from 3.5% to 4 to 5. So the net debt payment goes up rather substantially. If you look at the debt schedule, it goes from about $1.1 million to almost $2 million to almost $3 million. So the district faces some rather significant debt payments if we had done nothing with the existing bonds. You with me?
Yes.
So the debt payment increases. In addition, there was a year-end, because the 2010 refunding, jump in if I'm wrong on this, but the 2010 refunding had a final principal payment of almost $3 million. So what we're doing here is to attempt to flatten out that rate, have a level, stable annual debt payment so there's no big jump in our tax rates in the next 15 years. And at the same time, take advantage of the low bond interest rate. I think it's and the board and I have had long discussions about this. We've looked at many, many options. I think we've been prudent and I think we've been conservative. And I'm really interested, again, it's unfortunate you weren't here for all of our discussion, but I struggle with how we could have done this better. And of course, it's a little late now, but I'd be really interested in understanding how you think that might be done.
Can I just say, Bill, that I appreciate this perspective, and I think that a lot depends on the levy, right? So there's two moving parts here. The presentation from October 7th deals with the moving part of the restructuring of the bonds. The thing that we're talking about, maybe you just received today, has to do with what we do with the levy going forward, and I think that is a key issue. I think we have to be talking about them simultaneously. And so I think, so let's get to that.
Yeah, if you sit through it, and I'll open it up again. You know, we don't have it on our agenda, but if you bear with us for a little while, I'll let you come back and ask another question if you want. And why don't we just get to it and we'll have the presentation.
Now, when you say levy presentation, we're talking about the PMA one.
Yes.
In which we show different scenarios of the levy.
Right.
All right, good evening. Thank you for having me back. I think I was here early September and we had talked about your long-range financial projections at that time. Some of the information in this presentation is exactly what you saw last time. So I'm going to go through some of it pretty rapidly. If I gloss over something, Jane, or you, that you don't want me to move on that quickly, just say so, and I'll come back to it. We're going to look at, again, your revenue source, the FY14 budget, your revenue budget of $14.3 million is pretty much the springboard for our 5-year projections. And this just goes back to show that property taxes comprise about 90% of all of your revenue. So what we want to focus on are the assumptions that are in this first scenario, this baseline that we're going to deal with. So again, your property taxes are a function of your EAV, the CPI, and new growth. So this baseline has your EAV declining with this 2013 levy by 3% and then staying static thereafter. We have new construction in at 1.5 million, and I think that is throughout the 5-year projection. The CPI is known. It's 1.7% in 2013, and then we projected a 2% CPI thereafter. The average is really closer to 2.4, so this is relatively conservative. And most important, the 2013 levy in this baseline is based on your 2011 extension, not your 2012. And we have the opportunity here to reach back to 2011, which is a higher extension than your 2012 levy.
Because we abated.
That's right.
Because we lowered the operating levy intentionally to help eat up some of our reserves. That's a separate thing from the
Abatement, right.
Yeah.
Right, it's because we intentionally deficit spent.
Correct.
This
year we
year.
are
Take it by that.
And then basically all of the revenue we're holding flat. General state aid, you've heard this before, is prorated at 89% in 14 and 15, and then we drop down to 80% thereafter.
That was something I just read about recently, that they just announced that it's going to be at 80%.
But that's why we're in a good position. We don't rely on state funding.
Yeah, yes, you want to be relying on your property taxes in this day and age. Okay, the expenditure side then, your budget is $14.9 million, and it is, divided out. There's the pie. Salaries and benefits obviously are, as every other school district, the biggest chunk of your expenditures. Yeah, you can go. So what we have in there for expenditures is that salaries and benefits, teacher salaries, they are at the current contract level, and then you're going to be negotiating for the next 4 years, or for whatever you're going to negotiate for. But we've assumed similar costs from 2015 out. All other staff at 2% annual increases. We have employee benefits. The majority of that is your health insurance at a 5% annual increase. And then other expenditures, a lot of it we left flat, although special ed tuition, we put a 3% inflation factor each year. The transportation costs, contractual, 3% per year. And then in the O&M fund in capital outlay, we have a 3% increase per year, $1 million set aside for renovations in FY15, $500,000 in FY16, and then we flatten it out at $100,000 thereafter.
I want to jump in here just a second. And the O&M fund, it's 3% across supplies and services. So for operating, because your natural gas and electricity and all that is built into other. Also, we believe the bulk of these assumptions are very conservative. In the ed fund, we're projecting out flat. A little cut in supplies and services actually in fiscal year 15, and everything flat here out. Capital expenditures and education fund technology flat for the duration of this. So we believe they're being very conservative. And addressing the special education costs at a 3% per year increase, many years ago, I would have made that closer to like 10 to 15% increase. However, during that time, when I projected those large increases, our costs actually went down. However, with that, I'd like Kevin to kind of speak to this a little bit, just so you get a flavor when we start reviewing what our projections are going to be and how the 2013 levy is going to affect us next year and in future years. We believe this may be really overly conservative.
Kevin, I'll start out and then I'd like you to kind of add. As you know, I've kept all of you informed of the fact that one of the districts has notified us that they're pulling from NSSCD. That will have a direct impact on our cooperative costs. Along with that, I also notified you that 3 districts are pulling out of CEDAW, another special ed co-op, where we have many of our students placed. So we're really getting a double bang next year. And I would say 3% won't even cover. I think conservative is 15%, because nobody can really talk to us yet about what those increases will be as far as tuition, as far as cooperative costs, anything. And we have to keep that in mind. I think we're going to be covered through some of the scenarios that we went through again this afternoon. But it is extremely serious, and I'm going to have Kevin give some further. And then, Leanne, you may have a question with that too.
Yeah, I had a quick question. So the people that are pulling out, are the districts that are pulling out, are those are final notice pullouts, or is that sort of similar to what we saw in the past? Say that you're going to pull out, and then it's subject to some negotiation.
Actually,
I read very.
That's a very good
but
question. I would share from my working knowledge, and Kevin will duplicate that. The 3 districts that have pulled from CEDAW have, over the past 8 years, started moving all the programs into their buildings. So that's a pretty, for sure.
Okay.
As well as North Shore, but I'd like Kevin to kind of talk a little bit more about that so you understand the full ramifications.
And just for degree of magnitude, it's 3% of what? And what's the number?
I'll have to look. I believe we're right around $500,000 in that.
3% of the $500,000?
Yes.
So
So if you do 15% of $500,000, you know.
Wait a minute, 3% of $500,000?
Yes.
$15,000.
$15,000.
So I mean, we got a budget of $15 million. It's not, in magnitude, it's not a big deal.
And just speaking from a special education perspective, from what I know about the other district that is likely going to give their 18-month notice in January, it's a pretty final decision after having talked with the administrators in that district and in other districts in the area. That's a pretty final notice. There have been some ongoing internal conversations, and so people are they're fairly certain that that's going to happen. I just did some quick research. One of the other member districts for CEDAW, which is not our cooperative, but the cooperative right next door to us, is projecting a 17% increase in their tuition costs alone for their district, and that's for Oak Grove School District. That's not to mention the additional costs for the cooperative to be a member as a part of their levy. So, and that's with 3 pretty sizable districts pulling out: Stevenson, District 96, which is Killdeer, and Lincolnshire 103. Those are pretty sizable districts. It would be about the same number of students that are contained in the other district that is looking to pull out right now from NSSED. Maybe a little bit smaller, but not by too much. So we're going to be taking a pretty significant financial hit. We have currently 4 students between the 2 cooperatives placed in either of the cooperative programs, and they will be there for the foreseeable future.
Well, in terms of dollars, you say pretty significant. I like to deal in real dollars. So what does that mean?
So according to this other school district's website and their board minutes from the last time, they were looking at a total hit of $2.2 million to the co-op, that's CEDAL. And I don't have current estimates about how much this other school district pays in to NSSED, but I would imagine that it would be somewhere close to the same.
It's about 10% of their total revenue, and they're a $40-something million operation. I think $43 or $44 million.
But we also have to assume that NSSD is going to lay off some staff since they're not handling.
Well,
I mean, if they present a bill that is the same size, based on the same budget that they had before, then we really have a problem.
Well, I'll get into a little bit of this. I can talk about a little bit of this when I get into, I'll do a little bit of analysis. I can make it a lot shorter now since a lot of it's been covered. But I can share some of the discussion that kind of talked about that too.
But can I just add one quick thing, which is that that is partially true, but with 18 member districts, when one pulls out, the overhead doesn't go down so significantly. It's when several member districts pull out that the overhead would start to go down significantly, because you're going to be hiring fewer classroom teachers, you're going to be hiring fewer administrators, you're going to decrease the cost of coaching across all of the districts, so the overhead will not decrease as significantly as you might think.
Very complicated.
Yep.
Thank you.
But if we do, let's say 20%, which is your upward estimate, right, of what is it, 500 or even 600? Let's do it that way. You know, it's you know, we're talking about $100,000 or $120,000, and we would still, if I look at the projection, we have $9.6 million in 2019. So I think there's some cushion there.
And I think that's what John's trying to get to. When we went through this afternoon, it's covered in many areas, but we need to keep it in mind as we move forward, because Jane will point that out to us as we go through here.
That's why the 2013 levy is so important, because
Right, exactly.
we need to levy sufficiently in 2013 in order to provide sufficient dollars up going into the future.
Because of the compounding effect.
Yes, which is kind of what I think what Bill was getting to. And for the last...
Yeah, the final expenditure assumption that is in this baseline and all of the projections we'll see tonight is that defeasance that you're going to talk about later tonight of $5.7 million. That would be in your FY15 expenditure side, and then there were subsequent abatements of, it's actually $470,000. I think but the $470,000 is in the numbers. That's just a typo there.
Yes.
So those are the assumptions for baseline. The other things I need to state are that this does not include any legislative changes that might come along in school funding, none of which we can anticipate right now. It also assumes that the state funding obligations are met, and they're doing a better job at meeting their obligations. It assumes no added cost to the district to fund the TRS problem, pension problem. And again, we really don't know at this point what's going to happen there. And it also assumes no added cost for healthcare reform beyond the 5% annual increase that's in here. All right, so having done that, the next several pages are the individual funds. And with this baseline projection, if you look at, this is the Ed Fund, the biggest fund. well, now you're in the O&M fund, anyway.
Yeah, I'm gonna go.
Yeah,
I'm
you wanna
gonna
just
skip
flip to the aggregate.
aggregate.
That's fine with me too. Operating funds baseline, okay. With these assumptions, it shows that in FY14 you will have a deficit of about 2 million. Next year with that defeasance, you'll have a deficit of a little over 5 million. And then each year thereafter, there would be a surplus with this levy. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, and this baseline makes the assumption that we are levying to capture every dollar we possibly can.
In every year.
And in every year,
Yes.
And we've had to make assumptions, as you know, towards the EAV, et cetera. So that's what this baseline represents, is if we can get, which is kind of what we've been doing historically.
Just to kind of show you what would happen if
Right.
that were the
And in
case.
this
Why don't you
case-
flip to the, oh, go ahead.
Just to make, Bill addressed this graciously in the beginning, I just want to make sure we reiterate it. In this case, although the fund balance dips to roughly 10 million, it gets back to almost 16 million by 2019,
Correct.
Or 91.5%.
or 91.5% of our budget.
Yes.
Okay.
So, in the picture of this, Jane is, oh, did you want to see something else?
Yep.
All right, is depicted on this chart, which you have seen before. The red line is your ending fund balance for each one of those years.
The purple is the low point during the year, though, right?
It could be a problem.
Yeah.
It's not a problem here.
No, but I'm just for definitional purposes. That's how low it could go during the year when we're paying our bills.
And
Just
plus,
simply
it's
because-
probably around the first part of May.
But that's a cash flow thing.
That's
That is
okay.
cash.
Yeah.
Right. And this also shows, maybe this is too much detail, but you know, at the bottom, the ed fund and where that ends up, and the O&M, transportation, all your other funds. Basically, what this model does is try to keep all of the other funds on a pretty level, even keel, minimal amount, and any excess is put into the
You
other.
almost ran out of color in your palette.
Oh, geez, that would not be good. All right, the next scenario is a 2013 levy based on the 2012 extension. Remember that first one is on 2011 because we want to reach back and grab as much as we, well, maybe that's not the best way to put, reach back and grab,
Capture.
the EAV that's available to us. So, then on this one, you can see that in every year, if you look at the surplus deficit line, there is absolutely a deficit. Based on the same expenditure assumptions, just different revenue assumptions due to the levy. And then the picture graph of this really does show that you'd be down to 4.4 million in fund balance, and you could run into a problem with your cash flow in that final year. So that's something you want to be very wary of.
Does everybody understand about the reaching back to the 2011 extension? I think, okay. So this shows if we don't do that and we capture every dollar we can, but we use 2012 extension, this is kind of how it plays out. You have a question?
I understand it, and maybe my question relates to the next scenario, though. But I do have a question about that.
Shall we move to the next one?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, we would.
All right. So then this scenario is that the 2013 and 2014 levies are based on need only. Basically, what we were trying to do was match your revenue to your expenditures in 2013 and 14 through the levy process.
As we have done in the budgeting.
This is based on, we project out expenses, we project out what little local and state and federal revenue we're going to get, and we fill in the difference with tax revenues, with levy. So,
And here, the extensions are based on the 2011.
correct. We would have to use the
Yes.
11.
2011. And so in the next year, is it based, do we still reach back to 2011 or is it
The
2013?
2013, once you
It becomes
get
the new
higher
year.
than 2012, it becomes your new,
Right.
Because it's higher than 2012.
yes,
Yes.
yes.
And that's a one-time opportunity, right? To go
As
back.
long as it's, yes, more or less. The only way we could reach back, if we don't reach back this year, is if our levy for 2013 is lower than the monies we received in 2012. But I
That's
don't
not
see we're going to do that.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay.
So it would be a one-time
So
reach back.
this-
So that's why the 2013 levy is going to set the
Yeah, it's
It's just
huge.
a tone for the future.
set us on track here.
Right.
and
Oh,
what
it's
happens in the
huge.
future.
Right.
And it becomes so it becomes the new.
Correct.
It becomes the new base.
Yeah,
Correct.
it does. And you can see in this one based on need only that again in the first 2 years there's a deficit, but then we tried really hard and we didn't get exactly, but we tried to keep any surplus to an absolute minimum. We were working for zero, but we couldn't quite get there.
I just want to point out, I'm not sure if everybody's aware, just to be clear, we're not voting on levy
No.
stuff. And this isn't for you guys, it's for people watching or in the audience. We're not voting on the levy tonight. That gets approved in December, right?
You're going to establish an estimated levy at the November 12th meeting.
Okay.
But there's another meeting prior to
Prior to
that.
that, where we're going to talk more. Okay.
November
Just so
5th,
everybody's clear.
yeah, November 5th meeting, we'll talk more than the November 12th, right?
But-
Sweet.
The reason this is so important for this meeting is exactly what Bill just raised, right?
Exactly.
Because these two items don't
They
they
work
impact
together.
one another, right?
They do. They work together.
Jane, you want to flip just to the
Well, we really
graph?
handicap future boards if we don't go back to 2011, and yet the future boards can make a decision to adjust levy accordingly because they'll be on safe grounds with respect to the 2013 levy.
Right, because if you look at the reserve for 2019, and you may want to read it out loud for the TV audience because they may not see the picture that we're talking about.
10 million,
10 million, well,
right,
Which we're back to about 50,
We're
projected about 58%
which is
total.
58%.
Which is over what
which
we're-
is,
right.
satisfactory cushion.
And the fund balance policy that we're currently developing is looking at a fund balance between 30 and 50%,
Right.
which I think we'll probably
And
stick with that.
And John just said it when he said we don't want to tie the hands, of future boards or even yourselves next year. What we need to do because the expenditures, I believe, our assumptions are conservative. So something, next year you may make a different decision in regards to the levy. We're making an assumption to just levy enough to cover expenditures that following
And we may
year.
have new
Those
information.
expenditures may be higher
Right.
than what we projected. You still have collective bargaining to get through. In 2018, we may be assessed with the Cadillac tax on our health insurance program, which is estimated at just about $200,000. That's not in here. But if we establish a good 2013 levy, and we're kind of recommending, this just to cover, it can set the tone so future boards can capture what they need to capture without necessarily doing major expenditure cuts or program cuts. We want to maintain the status quo of our services.
This scenario number 2 sets forth a budget that in 13 the levy is based on need only, but also in 14 based on need only. So it doesn't.
Correct.
In 13 and 14 doesn't assume we're going to levy to the maximum
No.
extent of our ability.
I wanted I wanted to give you, if I had just asked them to project out to obtain maximum dollars in 14,
Mm-hmm.
I think it would have been too much money, would have grown it. So I don't think that's something that the board is going to want to consider. So I did this for 2 years in a row and then let PTEL calculate to give you
The
what I
levy.
think is a
Okay.
legitimate scenario, but doesn't really
And the
handcuff
way-
future
the-
boards.
Sorry, the way you've done it, it ends up pretty consistently at 60%. But that assumes in 2013 we levy to need, 2014 we levy to need, and then 15 and beyond levy to what PTEL calculates.
Then you're capturing
Right.
maximum number of dollars
Okay.
allowed.
But by that time, we'll drill down into it a little bit deeper and reassess.
And by then we're going to know
Probably the budget.
we're going to know more on not only expenditures, but we're also going to know more on EAV and where's the CPI falling and new
Right.
construction. We keep hoping that some point in time the real estate
Pension.
market's going to.
I just also though want to remind people, and I may do this several times, 2 years ago, the tax rate was at 2.508. And last year, as a result of the abatement decisions we made, the $2 million to use the reserve to offset expenses and the $1 million to pay off the bond debt, reduced the tax rate to 2.19. Went down quite substantially. We also have really nice reductions in our tax bills. Well, we can't do that this year, of course. That's a one-time event. So though the tax debt payment has to be paid again this coming year, and that's worth in total about 31 cents. So our tax rates are going to go up pretty substantially, even though we're restructuring bonds, as a result of the fact that we did the abatement last year. And I think everybody needs to be aware of that. And our tax rates are going to come back, not to where they were, so hopefully some of the restructuring will offset that, but they are going to come back rather substantially from where they are this year. Am I?
I've got a slide that
Oh, you have a slide, okay.
separate
Okay.
document that I can show if we.
Because I know I've had people come up to me on the street and were quite surprised when I had this discussion with them that their tax rates were, they thought the tax, since the tax rate went back to 2.19 with the abatement last year, that was going to continue forever, and that's just not going to happen.
Okay, just to jump to what John is talking about here. What I've shown here, 2013, this is your scenario 2. This is levying just to cover expenses, basically. This shows from 2010, these are extensions for each of these levy years. In 2010, remember, is the 11-12 fiscal year. So 2012 is the 13-14 fiscal year that we're in. So this is going to be for the 14-15 fiscal year. So should we proceed with a levy that's similar to what we're estimating this evening, going back to 2011 and even bringing back in our almost $1.2 million bond payments, we're still going to receive almost $250,000 less in tax revenues than we did 2 years ago. We're still going to receive a little under $500,000 less than we received from the 2010 levy 3 years ago. So though we're having to bump it back up to cover expenditures and get out of deficit spending, we have to bump it back up so we can still make our debt payment, and not out of pure abatement. We're still levying less tax dollars and receiving less tax dollars to benefit taxpayers, but maintain our services and programs.
I hope that cleared up anything.
So we're gonna go back.
Mr. Jennings, is there more to cover? More slides that you want to cover?
No, we're here to answer questions if you have
Do any of you guys have questions that you want to raise, or points or issues for discussion?
I just think we've had a long discussion this afternoon about this, that it's important we convey in a transparent fashion what's going on here, because it is complicated. I didn't understand it myself the first time, and Jane and Jean helped me through it this afternoon. It is complicated, but we need to be open and transparent and display it in a fashion that most people can understand, because their taxes are going to go up this year.
That's correct.
If I may, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
If I may say, I think that the part of the argument is actually the dollar amount in relationship to not last year, which was an odd year because of the various cut we did, but actually 2012. So the argument to be presented is how much are we levying in relationship to 2012? And we are, according to your data, we are levying how much?
15.3, 4.2 for operation.
So basically, how does it stack in relationship to 2012?
Well, 2012.
Which was the last time we had a normal levy, right?
No,
That was
2011.
2011, I'm sorry.
2011 at 14.9, so we reduced our levy by almost $750,000.
Okay, so that's the argument.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Anybody else? Bill, you want a question? Or Dave, you got a question?
No.
Dave or
I
Dave?
don't know how to express it.
All right.
Yeah. Thanks, that was very helpful because I don't know, my wife went to a special meeting that you guys had when, I think the first time William Blair came here, and I don't know.
That was in September, early September, I think, yes.
Yeah, and
It's changed a lot.
looking at those numbers, it only showed 1 year of revenue, and then the rest of it was just the differences between the bond payments. So I was only seeing the expense side, and I couldn't tell, I didn't know that the 1 year of deficit spending was sort of planned as part of the abatement and it was going to go away. So I'm glad it's not a recurring thing. So I was thinking, well, we're going to run out of money pretty quick here. We're going to just keep deficit spending. So that makes me feel more comfortable. And I also, with the negotiations on the collective bargaining coming up, I really don't want to, see a tactic that was displayed with respect to the high school negotiations where the union thought that the reserves were something that was fair game for bargaining. So one question I had though in these numbers and the projections that you're running is that I don't really see any CapEx. Is there going to be we need?
Yes.
The middle school needs some work, doesn't it?
That's a good question. And actually, within the expenditures, we built in $1.5 million for capital expenditures for facilities at the middle school, based on the BLDD.
Can you
facility
go
study.
back to?
Yep.
I think it's slide 16. We can show where that is.
It's actually buried in one of the numbers.
Well,
It's in the assumption.
it's in.
And that's
But-
just for the
But I think you can see
1.4.
the line item. I think you can see it on the line item, right? On 16 or no?
Yeah, it's on one of them.
It's on
It is
page
a line
19. It's on page 19.
But on top of
Operations
that
and
then, Bill, we also have additional reserves over the 50% that the board will be considering some other additional renovations to the middle school.
So I think this is a very important point, and we cannot lose track of it. But one is O&M, right? This O&M expense is maintenance. We've got
This
to
is transportation.
do some tuck pointing. We've got it, and it's there. I can't.
We've got $1 million included in fiscal year 2015 and $500,000 included in fiscal year 2016.
So that's
I just plugged them in those 2 years. It may happen a different year, but we've got the $1.5 million built in there.
so that's to make sure the building continues to function.
That was the kind of maintenance type needs as identified by BLDD in the facility
Right.
study. It does not address anything
Educational
along educational
adequacy.
adequacy or security to the
Right.
front entrance. That is not assumed in here.
But the thing that makes me comfortable with these projections, and obviously everybody looks at this differently, is that we end up at 60% with these, 59.7%. I'm still looking at page 16, but and our discussions have been around 25 to 50% of essentially unrestricted fund reserves, fund balance is how I'm sort of thinking of that. I think there's room in there for some discussion about how to spend some money toward educational adequacy concerns that were raised in the BLDD report. Am I speaking in code, or do you understand what I'm saying? I think we really need to think about that.
And
One of
G
the
is
things-
bringing us a recommendation at our next meeting
Oh, great.
of exactly where to start
Yeah,
and how
we-
to do that in a way that is thoughtful and looking to the future needs of that building, involving the community. So.
I think two things. The BLLD recommended about $2.5 million in sort of updated requirements over the next 3 to 5 years. And my thinking was that we should have at least enough reserves to cover that if that's required. The second thing, the educational adequacy portion or assessment portion, we were asking administration to come forward and say, this is what we need. It's not up to the board to tell them what they need. They're working there every single day. So we've asked them to come forward with a proposal about what their requirements are in a prioritized way so that we can then evaluate those to determine what the cost is and whether we'll need to access reserves and how much that will be.
Okay, I'm just trying to recall this, but I thought after the referendum that resulted in the new school being built, that sort of phase 2 of that whole project was supposed to be some substantial CapEx at the middle school, like more than just you know, baseline maintenance or bringing it up to standards, is that now
That
part
was
of the
done.
past, or what is,
Yeah,
is
some of the things.
that making sense?
Some of that is covered in the,
Right? I don't know.
you're saying exactly what Susan's saying, it's we're just using different words. Some of the substantial things were covered in the educational adequacy report, and we're gonna be looking at different options that we'll be bringing the board for, and we have reserves to cover some of the different options. Some are more substantial than others, so it really will be up to the administration to recommend to the board where we're gonna get the biggest bang for our buck and making some changes at the middle school. So yes, we are covering that.
I'm sorry, I wonder if there could be some confusion, maybe not yours, but just among anyone watching, about the two reports that we got back from the architect. So one of them called for about $1.5 million worth of maintenance work to just keep up with what we have, kind of bring things up to
Yearly
where
maintenance.
they ought to be. And then they came back with a second report, which looked not just at the physical plant that's there now, but what we ought to have. So does what we have measure up to what you want to see in a modern school that's meeting the needs of the kids that are in it right now? And so there were two different reports. And I guess what we're saying is that $1.5 million that's here is to cover that basic maintenance for the building that we have, and that there will be a future discussion on the board, near future discussion about how to meet this educational adequacy thing that we frankly didn't score very well on, and probably looking at we would need to use some reserves to meet that, depending on what recommendations we get back from the administration.
It's definitely not something that's going to fall between the cracks. It will be talked about in detail.
And those types of things were the things that were discussed in phase 2. That's, I wasn't around here.
Part
That's
of
this type of
But
stuff.
phase 2 is
Part of
never
the phase 2
funded.
stuff was done.
Part of the phase 2 things have been done,
Right.
such as some updates to the science classrooms. We don't call them labs because they really aren't. We did some upgrades to science classrooms, and we updated the bathrooms, the student bathrooms. And that was critical. And of course, choral space has been talked about, and that's a big issue. And that was the report that VLD did over a year ago, along with the secure front entrance and accessibility. And we got some cost estimates on those items as well.
Bill, if you, I'd be happy to go over any of this with you at any time. So my email address is on the website. If you'd like to go through in more detail, I love spreadsheets. I'll go through it for you in more detail. I'd be happy to do that with you.
Okay, yeah, that's great. The only other thing I wanted to say was that, and I think Susan said this as well, but it seems to me that, I don't know in what kind of detail you're approving, this refunding tonight, but I'm not really sure how you can disassociate the levy from the choice that you're making with respect to the scenarios that have been presented here, because they seem to go hand in hand and one needs the other. So
I don't understand what you're saying.
well, we've presented a number of different scenarios based on different levies, and so
No, we're only talking about the upcoming levy. Okay? And it's the same, I think we're leaning towards scenario 2.
Correct.
So if you look at that, then just don't confuse yourself with all the other scenarios. If you look at scenario 2, you can see we're removing 5.75 million out of the reserve. And you can see what impact that has. We'll still have a $10 million left in the reserve next year, which is almost 61%.
right. Well, scenario 2 makes assumptions with
Page
respect to
16.
the levies, though, right? It's
For
you're
future
going back to
owners.
2011.
Yep.
And you're saying 2013 and 2014 are based on need only.
Right.
So those are assumptions that you're making.
No,
And
that's,
but you're going to make the levy decision 2 months from now or something. I'm saying that you're effectively making the levy decision today if you approve scenario 2. Is that not right? I mean,
I'm not sure what's your concern. Can you express that to me? Let's assume we do make the levy, which we're not doing, but let's assume we do. What's your concern?
That will change the way
No, I need to understand. I really don't understand what you're driving at.
I think the two are tied together.
What do you think?
You can't make one decision without making the other. If you're gonna choose scenario 2, you've already locked yourself into the levy.
And what's the alternative?
I don't know, scenario 1, do nothing. I mean, there's
Well,
lots of
we've
alternatives.
discussed the fact that scenario.
You're making the decision tonight. You tell me what the alternative is. I'm trying to understand. You're presenting scenario 2. That's what you want to do, and scenario 2 has assumptions with respect to the levies, but you're not making a decision on the levy tonight.
But
To
this
me,
is
they go
initial-
hand in hand. I don't know how you do one without the other.
This is a presentation, but we're not actually voting on this tonight. Tonight, we're only the
bond.
we'd be talking about the bond restructuring.
We've
And in a sense, they're not related because the bond restructuring, the funds for that are gonna come out of reserves. Whereas this is talking about funds for our operating budget, and then, whatever you have extra goes into reserve, but.
And the bond
That makes
scenario, the defeasement was included in every one of Jane's scenarios.
Right.
We've addressed that, and no
Right.
matter which one of these we decide to go with, which I don't think there's any options really except for the second one, but that was addressed in every one.
So the only thing that's being voted tonight is included in all of these scenarios, right? The 5.7 million defeasance and 470 in abatement, right? And that's in each of these scenarios. It was important to me to understand this before voting on that, because if scenario 1 was our only option after I vote the 5.7,
Then we're in trouble.
then I'm not voting for the 5.7 because exactly the concern you raised, right? But what I am hearing is that I'm comfortable with the 5.7 vote that's happening tonight because we know we still have this option for scenario 2. And further, that I'm hearing from my board that we're pretty well aligned around scenario 2 being the direction we want to go because it controls costs and provides us the opportunity to continue to make decisions going forward about CapEx, for example, and other kinds of expenditures. I don't know, Bill, if I addressed your concern.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm just making an observation.
Yeah.
It seems to me that, you can't tie yourself to the 2014 levy
Right.
now or even in
Yep.
2 months, right?
That's a good
So-
point, because even though we project for the 2014, that's a whole different decision.
If we were having a conversation and 6 of the board members today were saying scenario 1 is where we're headed, we're having a very different discussion about whether or not we want to tie our hands on $5.7 million today.
Well, right. I mean,
Right.
that's exactly what I'm saying.
Right.
I find it hard to disconnect the two.
And it isn't, but I think it's important we're all in front of the world here saying that this is the direction we're going, and unless something changes significantly in the next 2 months, I don't know what that would be. I would expect we're going to be voting on something that looks like scenario 2 for the levy in December.
Okay, well, that's good to understand because, I don't think you can make the decisions in a vacuum.
We're not. Thank you, we appreciate it. Anybody else have any questions or comments? I'd like to move on to agenda item 5B, which is the board planning calendar, which Dean's going to talk about.
Just a couple quick items. If you take a look at October, one of the things that I'll be presenting to you in November is the district information for school improvement for approval. So some of the October things are moved over to that. We have policies that Terry Hodges will be going over with us in November. I will be giving a teacher evaluation report in November. Our levy, we will be finishing discussions on. Our audit we've already done, so we'll move that back because we try to get that done in September. Kevin just finished the state library grant, so you'll get to see that. We will be starting to plan for next Washington DC trip next year
Thank you.
in our November board meeting, and we have some things to share with that, which Nate and I will be working on. The bullying policy, as you know, is being worked on, and that's something Terry's addressing when she comes on the 5th. Negotiations, we'll start discussing that with Terry Hodges when she's here. We actually had our superintendent evaluation discussion this evening, and then our review of unreleased closed session minutes. The only other thing that I would add is I will be taking this exact calendar and taking our work from Phase 3 strategic plan and putting in different reports for different months. So this calendar will actually be a lot meatier when you see it the next time. So that's my report.
Does anybody have any questions or comments about that calendar? Okay, we're going to move on to 5C board agreements, and I'm going to make a move that we postpone that till next week, or not next meeting when Julie is here, because I know she really likes those. So if everybody's in agreement with that, we will move to D.
So,
Board training, Jean? Do we need a motion to move past
No,
that?
these are just discussions.
discussion items, so we don't need it.
So I've received guidance to move forward. Board training, Jean asked you to come prepared to discuss some calendar dates, right?
Yes. What I would like you to do is between now and Friday, or before certain people leave on their trips, if you could email me your availability for the dates and your agenda.
Are you talking about daytime or nighttime?
Nighttime.
Okay.
So 6, 7, 9, 13, 16, 22, 29, 30. If you're interested in a weekend date, I can check with Bartoni on that. No, and I'm getting no on that. So give me availability on these. That will also help me because not only will we set our board training, but I will email dates to Lake Forest to get our tri-school district meetings going too. So email that to me as soon as you can.
Okay. Any questions about the board training calendar? I mean, the dates there? Item 5E, fund balance policy. Jean had some follow-up questions for us.
We will be giving final direction to Terry Hodges to write up our fund balance policy when she comes on October 5th or November 5th. But I'd like to kind of walk through what I have down from what I'm hearing you say. Definitely our preface is to make sure that we provide the highest quality education for each of our students while being fiscally responsible and attempting to stabilize taxes for our local community. The purpose, this is what I copied from the press policy. Superintendent or designee shall maintain fund balances adequate to ensure the district's ability to maintain levels of service and pay its obligations in a prompt manner in spite of unforeseen events or unexpected expenses, which we've discussed. The fund balances should also meet the minimum state of Illinois requirements as well as have enough fund balances so as not to jeopardize our district bond rating. The superintendent or designee shall inform the board whenever it should discuss drawing upon its reserves. So that's one of the triggers. We need to have, many of you had in your notes, a definition of fund balance to make sure that we're all on the same page with what we're referring to as fund balance. That would be a good legal definition for Terry to put in there for us. We need to make sure that we stipulate its fund balance to expenses. Many of you, and I already referenced it, but I'm going to reference it again, we want to make sure that nothing impacts our bond rating, because when we get too low, it can impact our bond rating. She can insert somewhere in there, we want a range of 30 to 50%. Some of you talked about the possibility of having this go higher if we were saving for a capital project. So that might be an exception in a fund balance policy that Terry could kind of maybe work in as an exception.
You know, I had a thought on this.
Okay.
If I may interrupt you. Board and superintendent shall monitor the fund balance and decide where, you know, if there's excess or if it's, you know, the reserve is dropping below what would be considered acceptable, and why is it dropping? In other words, there got to be a yearly monitoring of the fund balance.
And see, Chris, and I'm glad you brought that up because that fits in with what the trigger is going to be. One of the triggers, obviously, is as the board and the administration is looking Is it lowering, and if so, why, and is it gonna change?
Right, so I'm not sure I want to memorialize a trigger per se, because we can never anticipate what's going to happen. But I think that if we say that there should be a review of reserve position on a yearly basis,
On the calendar.
you know, and included in the calendar, and maybe you know, twice a year, something like this. I don't know.
To get ahead of them, so that we don't.
Right, but I don't want to especially put a trigger. I think the review is what will lead to the trigger. Either we have too much money or we don't have enough money, and then that will give us some insight as to, you know, the levy, et cetera, et cetera.
But if we only wait until we have a trigger, then we might be reacting too late. So if you have a review, you get ahead of those.
Exactly.
Yeah, my concern is that it doesn't get back up to 100%. So at some point when it gets close to 50, something happens.
Correct.
And
So-
that could be taken care of through a
And you
review.
could put in a language that it should not exceed, you know, unless it could go over, let's say, because we're doing CapEx and we know that we're going to accumulate money for 1, 2, 3 years, and then year 3 we're going to pull out and it's going to go back to its normal
An
level.
annual review could be perhaps part of the levy process. You know, it's something you do at that same time when you're talking about all these projections and what the impact's going to be.
Well, it's part of the
You're
budget.
going to get your annual audit right before you start talking about the levy, and that's the best picture you have at any given time of your fund balance. You review it really on a monthly basis. You see what your fund balance is via the treasurer's report, but that's a snapshot in time. But your annual audited numbers give you what your ending fund balance are. You'll have that information before you start the levy process. Also, you're going to get projections on a regular basis, so you can see ahead of time, here's what the direction we seem to be going. So you certainly want to, if it looks like your fund balance is going down, it's because the revenues are sufficient, or you're spending more than you're bringing in. That's where you want to stop that early before you get into dire straits.
It looks like plan for how fund balances over 50% would be spent. That would go into the paragraph on the exception if the board decided to accrue money for a couple years to buy something specific. So I think I figured out the trigger piece. And then the board, it's important, and I've heard this from you many times, to keep budgeting, fund balance, levy, everything together so that we review everything as a group instead of separately and together.
I had another comment in your, the school district seeks to maintain blah, 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 50% of the annual expenditure in each fund. Can we just do of all expenditure? Because I was given to understand that we can actually move money. I mean, funds are not restricted, correct? So I think it would be simpler just to look at the reserve as an overall.
Anybody else?
For that paragraph or in general?
Just in general.
I just like to comment that I think 30% may be too low. 25% is the point at which the state looks at you and says you're in trouble, you know, you have to have a plan to remediate this. 25% could be the place where you are having cash flow issues. And if we say 30% is the place that triggers conversation of the board, like there could be a problem here, that's putting us within $800,000 of the place where the state would then get involved, and it affects our bond rating and those kind of negative effects. So I just want to put that out there, that makes me uncomfortable. That seems too low to me.
Well,
Can you comment on that?
I thought the 25% provided us with the highest rating. So I'm a little confused now. Is that a warning point?
If you fall below 25%, then you
What
don't get
happens?
the highest.
There's 5 different areas that you're scored on, and one of them is fund balance. For a perfect score, you need a minimum 25%, and it's based on your ratio to revenues, not expenditures, which should be fairly close in theory. But It's a minimum 25% for a perfect score of 4 points on that.
Oh, so
particular
it's
item.
perfect score, not
On that
basic
particular
requirement.
No, and if you're below that, then that item, if you're below 25%, then you get 3, 2, 1, or 0 points. And then there are the other items in the financial profile that are scored.
In looking at these levies, Leanne, and looking at these levy projections, it looks like we're going to struggle to keep it under 60%, rather than worrying about going. I mean, I think I understand.
Can I add one more thing? Then I'm sorry to interrupt you. That I'm not saying I don't think we should ever get to 30%. What I'm saying is, to me, it seems like the discussion of where we're headed should happen before we get to 30%.
And
You know, like can we trigger that at 35 or 40 or something where we've got a little bit more room?
I think that if we levy close to the budget, and considering that we get 95%, right? What is the percentage? Of 89, 90% of what we're getting from real estate taxes, that scenario for me is pretty far-fetched. I mean, we'd have to spend money like drunken sailors to get down to 30%. You know, do because precisely, I think that this matters if you're in a district where you have, your real estate tax base is weak, and then you're getting a lot of more money from the state, which is a big if, or the federal government. I think that if we levy conservatively, and if we levy close to the budget, I think we should be okay. And we're going to see this, if we do this 5 years projection, we'll see it way before you get to the 30%. I mean, we'll see it start inching down. That's why the 5-year projections are really critical.
so that's what struck me just now after looking at those projections, is that we're not going to see it just all of a sudden be at 30%, right? Right. But and so what the length of the warning track seems to me pretty important, right?
Well, we review twice a year, and it's on the board calendar.
But we're going to be wanting to look out 5 years and say,
Right.
Scenario 1 makes it look like we're going to hit 25% in 2019.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to want to make an adjustment now, not in 2019, right?
The other thing is, I can argue, and I thought about arguing the same point on the high end. I think 60% is too high, personally. I can't figure out, and I've said this at least a dozen times, how we'll ever use this reserve beyond the 4 or 5 million we've talked about. And I've talked to my colleagues in the community, and they feel we're hoarding taxpayers' dollars at 60%, and they may very well be right. So I could argue that we should drop that down to 50, but I'm willing to compromise until I get a better understanding of where we're going with it. I've only been on the board 5.5 months, so I'm willing to compromise at 30 and 60 at this point.
And it seems like to me that we could become much more accurate with this once we have a couple of these other questions resolved.
Yes.
I think we've done some good work so far, but really nailing down what we're going to do, middle school and long range maintenance for either one of those buildings will make it a lot more comfortable to bring that
I
tighter.
think that.
Now, the range I have is 30 to 50.
It's 50.
And keep in mind that this is a policy set by the board.
Right,
So
so you
anytime
can,
you wanna
I
change
think
that-
it's a review policy. I mean, there's absolutely nothing
Why
that
don't we
prevents the
review the
board.
policy as we review the reserves
Sounds good.
twice a year?
I just think 30. I don't think 30 should be the floor of it, but
And I don't think
That's
50 should
Anybody
be
else?
Okay. You're on
40.
record.
I'm very
I'm
comfortable
good with
with
30.
30 being a floor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm very comfortable with that, based on worst case scenarios, the superstorm effect, what might occur. It's just, I feel that there's plenty building there, even at 30.
And I'm comfortable with 50 as the high, assuming that we are making capital expenditure and maintenance plans that are detailed that will address some of the fund reserve that we have right now. When I looked at those numbers for scenario 2 that were up on the board, I thought, okay, and we're at 60% with that fund reserve all the way through. Somewhere in there, we're going to take it down from that because we're going to be moving some money to capital expenditures, is my thought. that's why 50% I'm comfortable with, because I think that we're going to be making some plans, significant plans for some of that money that's there.
So I have all your notes written down. I'm gonna consolidate them again. I'm gonna put this back on the agenda. And Terry will be here for a closed session and before the meeting. Then she's gonna start the meeting out to discuss policies. And I wanna go through this with her so that she has her marching orders to develop the fund balance plan. So I'd like to have first reading in December. So we meet the strategic plan goal and board goal 3 by February 1st.
It's not too much, so you're gonna have her come and then you're gonna hand her this?
I'm gonna give it to her ahead of time so she knows, but I think that we still need one more time to talk through it with her so she can write it.
Okay.
She's working on the Julie and Susan policies right now,
Okay.
as well as another format.
That's how they're formally
that's what we-
referred to as?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Anybody else have a comment on the fund balance policy? All right, we're gonna move to reports. President's report is gonna be very short. Most of what I talked about, what I was gonna talk about was what has already been discussed at NSSED and their announcement that one of the districts has issued its intent to, has verbally made its intent clear that it will issue its 18 months notice to withdraw. That puts that in around July of 2015. That district is 112, which is Highland Park and Highwood. They're K-8. It's about 4,200 students. It's about 10% of NSSED's revenues. Kevin has heard on the street that that's a pretty firm commitment. Tim Thomas, the director there, did ask them the question, though, if our pricing came down, would we still be having this conversation? And the contact
That's interesting.
and the contact at 112 said, maybe not. So it's a little different than what Kevin's heard, but who knows? We did go through this process ourselves past 18 months or so. I decided to stick it out. One of the good things that came out of this conversation was it kind of released the elephant in the room at the NSSED board meeting when one of the new board members from Lake Forest said, well, why don't we talk about pricing structure at NSSED? And the current model is antiquated and changes in the wind, in the air. And as evidenced by what's going on at CEDAL and what has gone on at NSSED and is also going on in other co-ops in the state. And so we had probably a half-hour, 45-minute conversation on the future, how NSSED needs to remake itself, because the reality is many of these districts who are pulling out don't really want to. It's a lot of work. They would rather find a more efficient way to utilize NSSED. So it was a great beginning to what will be ultimately a very healthy conversation. Hopefully we'll work toward evaluating their current pricing model.
Superintendent report.
And that's all I wanted to share. If anybody had any questions about the NSSED stuff, I can address it if I can, or Kevin could. And then the next one is our superintendent report.
And I am going to continue with the conversation and just share that as a superintendent who's gone through all the refinancing and co-ops and looking at formatting, I have volunteered to sit on the finance committee this year. And I will be representing our North Shore region. Very concerned because I think that we need to make sure that our kids get the very best possible services, that we use our co-op to the best of our abilities. And as I've shared with the finance committee, sometimes it's just a matter of how they're reporting to us what we're getting for our money. And sometimes it's a matter of determining what the general overhead is that we all pay into, being a cooperative, and then going to more as a pay-as-you-go model, and that takes some time. So in the meantime, Kevin is very active with the special ed directors. Mark attends every finance or every regular board meeting.
Governors meeting.
Board governors, and I will be attending the meetings with Mark as well as going to finance committee, because that's truly the only way we're going to make sure that we're getting what we need for the dollars we put in for our co-op. So that concludes my report.
Okay, so now we're going to get into action items with discussion. And the first two items are particularly relevant. We've been talking about them all night. We're going to be voting on motions that, if approved, will affect the district's bond debt and fund balance. In item A, we're going to vote on a motion to issue up to $1.35 million in refunding bonds for the purpose of refunding certain bonds so that we can take advantage of lower interest rates. In item B, we're going to be voting on a motion to transfer up to $5.75 million from the education fund to the bond fund for the purpose of defeasing a portion of our existing debt and lowering our fund balance. And I wanted to comment on the reason we keep saying up to. We're going to use up to that amount of money is because it really depends on the exact interest rates that these bonds are executed at. The net effect will both will ultimately be to save taxpayers money in the long and the short term. And in a moment, John is going to give us a little more detail, but I got a couple more things to say before I turn it over to John. And this is also, you guys stole all my thunder tonight. Another thing I wanted to share that not everybody's aware of, but we are now, is that the fund balance remaining after the $5.7 million in transfer out of the education fund, along with the net effect of the final tax levy that we adopted in December, should be sufficiently healthy to allow us the resources to begin to consider addressing and planning for possible facilities concerns at the middle school. These are concerns that were brought to light in a recent facilities and educational adequacy report provided by Architect. And in this regard, Dr. Sophie was going to bring us her recommendations at the next meeting on how to move forward with that. And just one last thing before I turn it over to John. I just want to say thank you to everybody on this board. This is a really big time issue for this community. We worked really hard. I'm proud to be part of this board on this issue. We did a great job. I want to extend thanks to Jean and her staff for crunching numbers and doing all the work, and for Liz Hennessy and you and anybody else on your staff who you were here multiple times and spent a lot of time with us. We really appreciate that. And so just a heartfelt thanks to everybody, and I think we should all be proud of what we've done. This is a big deal. So, John, if you could give us a little bit of a detailed summary of exactly what we've done and why we're doing it, I appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Mark. It's not often that I think a school district can say to its constituents that we're going to save $2.5 million with absolutely no negative impact to the process of educating our kids. In today's interest climate, that's a pretty darn good return. So let me give you some background and some history about why we tackled this issue. The existing bonds, we had two sets of bonds, and Liz, if I misstep here, just jump right on in. We had the 2008 referendum bonds, and then we refunded bonds in 2010. The total debt sitting there was about $36 million, and when we were facing an increasing coupon rate on that debt, it was going from 3.5% a year to 4%, and then eventually up to 5%. That concerned us a little bit because obviously the bond debt payments increased at the same time. Finally, we were facing the final principal payment of $2.9 million at the end of the term, 2028. Our goal was to take advantage of the favorable bond climate that we're currently sitting in and to restructure this debt for three basic purposes. One, reduce the overall debt obligation to the district. We're going to do that. Two, to eliminate the increasing coupon rate, settle in as best we can on a relatively level and stable coupon rate. And three, to level out the debt service tax payment in such a way that it's more stable and predictable for our residents. And under the existing scenario, the debt tax payment was going to go up every 4 or 5 years, and therefore our tax rates would go up. This is going to level it out in a more sensible manner. The board goes back well over a year prior to me joining the board, certainly, in investigating this issue. But in the past 5 months, we've met with Liz, I think at least 5 times, either here or in the district offices, to study this, look at models, look at requirements. We've looked at dozens of different alternatives, and we've come to the conclusion that the one we settled on is actually the best one for the district. It leaves us, as Mark indicated, and you can see from the information we received tonight, with a very healthy fund balance of roughly $10 million. So tonight we vote on refinancing structure, debt structure, to use 40% of our existing fund balance of $5.75 million. Again, for the fifth time, I just want to remind everybody that we didn't have a tax payment last year, and that's why our taxes went down. We're going to have a tax payment this year. It's going to be offset to a certain extent by the soft landing that we're creating and also by the lowered tax debt. But nevertheless, it's going to go up. Unfortunately, we have to make a debt tax payment. That's reality. So I think that basically summarizes it. I agree with Mark. I think we've done, I've thought about this a lot in an attempt to come up with the best possible solution and compromise that we can come to. And frankly, thanks to Liz and what we looked at, I can't come up with anything much better than what we've done that satisfies all the requirements that we were shooting to satisfy.
Does anybody else want to say anything before we go to motions?
I just like to say I think it's the right thing to do. I'm glad we've done the work and discussion that we have, and I agree that it's going to leave us in a good financial position to take care of the things that we need to, as well as evening out that tax rate so the taxpayers get a little bit of break from what was going to happen. So I'm pleased to see this move forward.
I'd like to piggyback on what Leanne is saying, that I also agree with it. And also special thanks to John, who made a lot of this very understandable for myself and perhaps other people on the board, because he spent a great deal of time analyzing this and talking to other people in the community as well as... What's that?
That's what John does for fun.
Well, but he's really done his homework on this, and we're very fortunate to have a guy like this on the board.
We ready to start talking motions? Okay. Item, let's flip the page. After all that. 7A. May I have a motion to approve the resolution providing for issue of not to exceed $1,350,000 general obligation refunding school bonds for the purpose of refunding certain outstanding bonds and providing for the levy of a direct annual tax sufficient to pay the principal and interest on said bonds as presented.
So moved.
And a second. Christine, can we have a roll call, please?
Yes. Mark Baird.
Yes.
John Rosen.
Yes.
Chris Leshinger, yes. Leanne Charlotte.
Yes.
Richard Hegg.
Yes.
Susan Ryder.
Yes.
The motion has passed. Okay. B. 7, sorry, I keep flipping my page through. 7B, yeah. May I have a motion to approve the resolution providing for the transfer of funds from the educational fund to the bond and interest fund for the payment of certain outstanding bonds and authorizing and directing the execution of an escrow agreement in connection therewith and in connection with the issue of general obligation refunding school bonds as presented.
So moved.
Second.
Roll call, please.
Charlotte.
Yes.
Hegg.
Yes.
Leshinger, yes. Rosen.
Yes.
Ryder.
Yes.
Barry.
Yes. The motion is approved. Congratulations. Let's see.
So it's too late to ask if we have any questions of Liz while she's here.
Wait. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming and waiting.
And your patience.
Let's see. Okay, so we're on item C. Approval of a personnel report. There's two items. That's this one, right?
And there's only, exactly,
Okay.
just one item.
May I have a motion to approve the personnel report for the dismissal of Lisa Gross at LBES, a special ed aide, effective October 23rd, 2013.
So,
Second.
Second.
Can we have a motion, please? Can we have a roll call, please?
Hegg.
Yes.
Leshinger, yes. Rosen.
Yes.
Ryder.
Yes.
Barry.
Yes.
Charlotte.
Yes.
Motion is approved. Item D. May I have a motion for the approval of a personnel audit consultant and contract as provided in your board documents?
So moved.
Second.
Is there any discussion? Jean, you want to give us a 10-second summary of that one, just so people know?
Yes. As we discussed, there's a great need to audit all of our personnel operations. prior to our HR specialist and our business director leaving and retiring in the future. Darlene Larson's work is outstanding in this area. She's done this in numerous school districts. She will be auditing payroll, personnel records, certifications, interviewing, recruiting, all the work associated with personnel so that we can prepare for new staff.
Okay. May I have a motion? Oh, we already had that. Can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yeah, hang on, turn the page. Lechinger, yes. Morosen?
Yes.
Ryder?
Yes.
Barry?
Yes.
Charlo?
Yes.
Peg?
Yes.
That's it. Motion's approved.
You want to talk? You want Jane to give you an update on the snow removal?
Okay. So we're going to go to item E. May I have a motion to approve the snow removal contract as approved, as provided?
Well, thanks.
Jane is going to, we'll get into discussion.
Yeah,
We'll
so
summarize
moved.
it for
So we need a second.
Second.
Second. Okay, Jane, if you could walk us through that.
Sure, we've used Rogers Landscaping the past 2 years. It was a proposal approved 2 years ago, and it's time, we don't call it a bid because it's not sealed bid, but it's proposals for snow removal, and we need to get this done because we anticipate getting some snow in a few weeks. So.
Maybe this evening.
Not enough, hopefully, but we are recommending Mariano's quote. And just for your information, the past 2 years we've paid $12,000 a year.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions or comments or concerns?
I'm looking for the actual quotes here. There was quite a discrepancy there.
It's on page 120.
120, okay.
We thought they were
I thought they're pretty tight. Yeah.
Well, between 11, Mariani's 11 on up to 15 for Tovar. The other two, Rogers was 14. So, and what did we pay last year? 12?
12.
Yeah. So that's pretty reasonable actually for.
Very reasonable.
I'm responsible for the snow removal of the church parking lot too. So
How much?
a little experience here.
How much snow removal does Mariani do? I mean, what's their?
Steve Miller obtained all the quotes. I think they do quite a bit. He checks references. I can't tell you who he called for references, but he was very comfortable with recommending them, and he's very fanatical about snow removal. It's not easy to do in our elementary school, the way the parking lot is designed. So
I actually went back on the website to find out average snowfall because I'm a geek.
It's on.
And it's, well, but historically, you know, do we go over the 50? And we actually rarely go over the 50.
Well, I beg to differ as an amateur weatherman. We had 2 70-inch years in a row 3 years ago. I'll take you home and I'll share my records with you.
Can we have any further meaningful conversation?
This is a geek fight.
Cost of de-icing, is that included in there? I see if there's no additional cost. I assume that's included?
it's included, yes. But they come
Right.
in and spread de-icer. I won't call it salt, but spread de-icer on the asphalt areas, parking
Okay.
areas.
So regardless of what, if you have a half an inch of snow, they'll still come out and de-ice the sidewalks and things for you?
I think it's 1 inch.
Okay.
Okay. We're ready to vote. If we can have a roll call, please.
Lechinger, yes. Morosen?
Yes.
Ryder?
Yes.
Barry?
Yes.
Charlo?
Yes.
Peg?
Yes.
Okay. May I have a okay, now we're on item E. May I have a motion to approve, oh, sorry, item F. To approve the P card report as provided.
So moved.
Second.
Discussion, concerns, comments? Roll call vote, please.
Morosen?
Yes.
Ryder?
Yes.
Barry?
Yes.
Charlo?
Yes.
Peg?
Yes.
Lechinger, yes.
Motion's approved. May I have a motion to approve the bills payable report as provided?
So moved.
Second.
Anybody have any questions, comments, or concerns on bills payable? Roll call vote, please.
Ryder,
Yes?
Barry,
Yes.
Charlo,
Yes.
Cottrell, I'm sorry, Haig,
Yes.
Letchinger, yes, LaRosa.
Yes.
Motion's approved. Item H, approval of the treasurer's report. May I have a motion for approval of the treasurer's report as provided?
So moved.
Second.
Discussion? Roll call vote, please.
Barry,
Yes.
Charlo,
Yes.
Haig,
Yes.
Letchinger, yes, LaRosa.
Yes.
Ryder,
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm voting for you, I apologize. I'm sorry.
Yes.
I'm going to speed the process along here.
Yes.
Item I, approval of activity reports. May I have a motion for the approval of activity reports as provided?
So moved.
Second.
Discussion? Roll call vote, please.
Charlo,
Yes.
Scott, Haig,
Yes.
Letchinger, yes, LaRosa,
Yes.
Ryder,
Yes?
Barry.
Yes. Motion is approved. Consent agenda. Every month, the board can choose to place items that are either reoccurring, such as the approval of previous minutes, annual responsibilities, such as the appointment of a school treasurer for the next year, or items of a regulatory nature that must, by law, be approved by the board. These items can be combined into one motion and passed together as part of a consent agenda. The board regularly screens its consent agenda each month and removes motions from it that, in the board's judgment, might otherwise require discussion or public comment. Before we go, does anybody need any of these items removed from the consent agenda?
No.
Okay, we have a motion to approve the,
Second.
approve the following items on the consent agenda. 1, regular meeting minutes dated September 24th, 2013. 2, budget hearing meeting minutes dated September 24th, 2013. Number 3, closed session meeting minutes dated September 24th, 2013. Number 4, destruction of closed session tapes of April 10th, 2012 and April 24th, 2012. Now is where you say so moved. May I have a motion for all of that?
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
Discussion?
Yeah, you could read that faster next time.
I'm working on it. May I have a roll call vote, please?
Haig,
Yes.
Letchinger, yes, LaRosa,
Yes.
Ryder,
Yes.
Barry,
Yes.
Charlo,
Yes.
Motion's approved. That is our action items for this evening. Future agenda items. Does anybody have future agenda items that they would like to see added that we make sure we discuss? One will be the middle school, right?
I was just gonna say too, we're gone on the IASB rep, because that would need to be done for November, and really keep people going. Policies, are coming forth: strategic planning phase 3, LBMS, collective bargaining. And then I was also going to share that our elementary school, as you know, won an attendance award from Lake County. And I wanted to thank Kevin for applying for that. And I wanted to thank Jane for all of her work with all the financials. And then just know that the annual statement of affairs will be published in November.
Is that a regulatory thing that we have to do every year?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
And I want to thank all of you, because the past 5 months have been busy. And it's all, the rubber's hit the road, so this is good.
I think it's been said before, but just to reiterate, the work that everyone did on the strategic planning that came together a week ago, I guess, and a report out to us was really an incredible amount of work, and the community members who are involved just really should be commended again. I know you already have, to just on the amount of dedication that they put into that process.
They've been wonderful.
It's all good.
They really have.
Anybody else have anything? Again, a last chance opportunity for public comments if anybody wants to address the board. Anybody at home, if you need to get in touch with us.
David, go right ahead.
All of our contact information is on the website. We'd love to hear from you.
Dave, I've never heard you this quiet before.
May I have a motion to at 8:37? May I have a motion to adjourn, please?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All
Aye.
opposed? No. The meeting is adjourned.
Good job.